Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The rain had not fallen in 3 weeks, but the air in ABA that morning still clung to the skin like grief. Dust rose lazily in the distance, stirred by early footsteps and iron spoons clinking against metal pots. Life moved on like it always did, but not for Adaobi. She stood barefoot in front of the basin, her hands moving with practiced rhythm as she washed the last piece of Obina's white shirt. The shirt had a scent that was no longer his. It smelled of perfume she didn't wear and skin she didn't know. The foam from the soap crept under her nails, stinging slightly, but she'd barely noticed. Her mind had become a village of whispers, thoughts running around like restless children. She had been waking up before the birds lately, staring into the dark corners of their bedroom, searching for answers that wouldn't come. The sheets were colder than usual. Obina still came home, still ate, still kissed her on the forehead sometimes, but there was a distance in his eyes that even silence couldn't bridge. She told herself it was just the stress from his new business, that money changes a man's tone, not his heart. But deep down, a quiet voice had begun to grow, a voice she didn't yet have the courage to listen to. Outside, her neighbor Mama Chinello called out to her with a joke about pregnancy making women glow. Adaobi smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. She had wanted this pregnancy more than anything. After 9 years of waiting, fasting, and rubbing concoctions that burned her belly, this child was a miracle. Yet joy now lived like a visitor in her chest, unsure whether to stay or go. The compound had transformed since Obina's contract came through. What used to be a small bungalow tucked between tall grass and untamed trees was now a cement-finished house with tiled floors and tinted windows. They now had a generator that ran through the night, even if the fuel sometimes drank more money than sense. The house had grown, but Adaobi sometimes felt like she was shrinking inside it. Before the money came, she and Obina were one. They shared roasted corn under moonlight, whispered dreams between sips of Gary, and danced barefoot on the sand whenever good news arrived. He once told her, laughing through yam-filled cheeks, that she was the only woman who made poverty feel like paradise. But lately he no longer laughed that way. He returned home later and later, his phone always face down, his smile thinner than a dying candle. Adaobi did not pry. She had been taught that a wife must learn to eat her questions with her food. But questions have teeth, and they gnawed at her constantly. One afternoon, as she rearranged his wardrobe, she found a strand of long, wine-colored hair tangled in his singlet. She stared at it for minutes, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat. She didn't say anything when he came home. That night, she cooked his favorite vegetable soup with pounded yam, and he ate without looking up. There was a time he would pinch her waist playfully while eating, saying, "This soup tastes like it wants to marry me." But all he said now was, "Thank you." And thank you never fed a heart. Even the maids had changed. There was a new girl, slim, sharp-eyed, and far too comfortable in Obina's presence. Her name was Nina, or so she claimed, and she said she was sent from a trusted cousin in Lagos to assist with house chores while Adaobi approached her 3rd trimester. But she dressed like she wasn't here to sweep floors. Her blouses were always too tight, her skirts too short, and her voice too sweet. Adaobi watched her closely. She noticed how Nina laughed loudly at Obina's dry jokes, how her hand lingered on his shoulder a moment too long, how her eyes scanned Adaobi from head to toe like she was measuring what little dignity she had left. Obina, to his shame, didn't seem to mind. If anything, he encouraged it, smiling when he thought Adaobi wasn't looking, letting Nina serve his food even when Adaobi reached for the tray. One evening, as she approached the sitting room from the backyard, she heard the two of them talking in hushed tones. Nina was saying something about people who don't know how to keep a man. Adaobi stood there, not making a sound. Her hands trembled, but she swallowed the ache like medicine. Later that night, Obina lay beside her like a stranger, scrolling through his phone while she lay facing the wall. She thought of home, her real home in Nsukka, where her mother once told her, a woman must guard her marriage the way a hen guards her only chick. But no one warned her that sometimes the chick turns and pecks the hen's eye. Morning brought with it the pretense of normalcy. Adaobi dressed carefully, tying her wrapper above her belly and brushing her hair into a neat bun. She lit a stick of incense and whispered a quiet prayer, her lips moving but her mind somewhere far away. That afternoon, Obina returned home earlier than usual with a surprise. He said they would be hosting his mother and uncles from Awari for a small gathering to celebrate the grace of expansion. Adeobi managed a nod, her heart already racing. She hadn't seen his mother in months. Not since the incident when she accused Adeobi of using charms to trap her son after the years of barrenness. That woman never hid her contempt. Still, Adeobi cleaned every room, swept the compound twice, and asked Nina, through tight lips, to prepare the jollof rice. The gathering was full of smiles too white to be true. Obina's mother arrived in full regalia, her coral beads clicking like angry teeth. She brought with her a wrapped box and placed it on the center table with ceremony. "This," she declared, "is the family necklace. It has passed through the necks of strong women in our bloodline. Adeobi, you will wear it soon, if you remain worthy." The word hung in the air like the smell of kerosene. Adeobi bent low in thanks, but something in her chest tightened. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep and the house was dark, the necklace disappeared. And with it, everything Adeobi thought she still had. Nina walked through the compound as though she had grown there, like one of the tall, lean pawpaw trees that leaned lazily behind the kitchen. She moved with the grace of someone who had never bent to sweep, someone whose hands had never carried a basket of cassava from the farm. Her presence in the house had begun as something small, like a drop of oil on white fabric, innocent and barely noticed. But over the weeks, that drop spread. She no longer helped with cooking. Instead, she passed instructions to the maid like a second wife. Adeobi noticed how she had stopped calling her auntie, and now simply said her name, the same way you'd say the name of someone you pitied. Obina, once full of fire for boundaries and respect, now chuckled when Nina mocked Adeobi's old wrappers or her swollen feet. "She's only joking," he would say, not seeing the way Adeobi blinked fast to hold back tears. But Nina wasn't joking. She was probing, testing, pressing into spaces that were sacred. One morning, Adeobi found her wearing one of Obina's t-shirts, the one he used to sleep in when their love was still young and laughter still lived in their bedroom. When she asked her about it, Nina shrugged and said, "He gave it to me to use while cleaning." The lie was effortless. Obina, when confronted later that evening, simply said he didn't remember. That was the part that hurt most, not that he lied, but that he had become so indifferent, so casual in his betrayals. Adeobi didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply watched them both like someone watching fire inch closer to a straw hut. She began to feel like an intruder in her own home, a visitor overstaying her welcome in a story where her name was no longer in the script. The neighbors noticed, but no one said anything directly. People rarely interfere when a woman's house is burning. They prefer to whisper about the smoke while fanning their own roofs. One by one, the greetings Adeobi used to get in the mornings turned into polite nods, and then into silence. Some began to visit less frequently. Others shifted toward Nina, drawn by her flashy smiles and big city confidence. She bought new chairs for the compound and called it refreshing the house. She hired painters without informing Adeobi and instructed them to change the color of the sitting room walls. Walls that Adeobi had once painted herself while humming lullabies to her unborn baby. Even Obina's family began to speak differently. His younger sister, who used to run errands for Adeobi, now called her Madam, with a sarcasm that dripped like sour palm wine. Obina's mother, after a Sunday visit, pulled him aside and said, "Nina looks like someone who knows what she wants. Not all women are born to be quiet like your wife." He didn't correct her. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though someone had finally put language to a feeling he didn't know how to express. In truth, Obina was changing faster than the seasons. Money had given him a taste for attention, for admiration, and Nina was a woman who fed both without shame. She flattered him in ways Adeobi never thought necessary. "You're a king," she would whisper, "a lion among men." And Obina, who had once giggled like a boy at Adeobi's farm jokes, now puffed his chest and walked with the arrogance of someone who believed every word. Adeobi tried to remind him of their early days, the days of cold baths and shared akra by the roadside, but her words fell like pebbles against iron. He was drifting, and she was running out of places to anchor her heart. One night, long after the lights were out and the house had fallen into an uneasy silence, Adeobi heard voices behind the kitchen window. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She had gotten up to ease her bladder, a constant burden in her third trimester, but the words floated to her ears like moths to flame. Nina was speaking in hushed tones to someone on the phone. "Don't worry, it's working. He barely looks at her anymore. I just need a little more time. Once everything's in place, she'll be out of the picture for good." Adeobi stood frozen, heart pounding against her ribs like a drum at a funeral. She leaned closer, careful not to make the wooden window creak. Nina laughed softly. Yes, I know what I'm doing. Trust me. The fool is eating from my palm. She doesn't even suspect anything. That night, Adeobi didn't sleep. She lay next to Obinna, who snored gently beside her, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, memories, fears. She thought about the necklace, the strange way Nina's eyes had lit up when it was brought out. She remembered how Obinna's mother had seemed too eager to mention worthiness. She began to see the pattern, the quiet rearrangement of power within the house, like termites eating away at wood from the inside. Adeobi pressed her hands against her belly and whispered a prayer into the darkness. She asked for strength. She asked for clarity. But most of all, she asked that whatever trap was being laid for her would break before it caught her soul. The day everything cracked began like any other. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, the gate creaked open as the maid fetched water, and the compound buzzed with routine. But there was a tension in the air, a silence beneath the noise, like the moments before a downpour. Adeobi was in the kitchen preparing yam porridge when she heard the shout. Where is it? Who took it? Obinna's mother had arrived unannounced and was now pacing the living room, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist. The necklace was gone. Obinna's voice joined hers, loud and accusing. A search began. Bags were opened, drawers pulled apart, wardrobes stripped down. Adeobi's hands shook as she wiped off the palm oil from her fingers and stepped into the chaos. Nina stood in a corner, arms folded, face blank. Then came the moment, too fast to stop, too loud to forget. One of the uncles shouted from the guest room. It's here. I found it. He held up the necklace, dangling from his fingers like a noose. It was in her clothes trunk. Deep at the bottom. Gasps erupted. Accusations flew. Someone grabbed Adeobi by the wrist. Obinna's face turned to stone. How could you? He asked, voice thick with disgust. Adeobi tried to speak, but the words clung to her throat like wet cloth. Nina stepped forward, crocodile tears in her eyes. I didn't want to believe it, but we all saw where it was found. That was the beginning of the end. The maid covered her mouth. The compound grew quiet, and Adeobi, heavily pregnant and barefoot, was escorted out of the compound she once called home. Her reputation shattered, her soul bruised, and her unborn child listening to the echoes of shame. The sky over Enugu was a quiet gray the day Adeobi arrived, the kind of sky that looked like it knew secrets but refused to speak. The tricycle that dropped her off struggled up the last hill before stalling in front of a low mud-walled house tucked between two tall mango trees. The driver helped her down, her swollen belly straining against the wrapper tied around her waist. She thanked him softly, gripping her tattered bag in one hand and balancing herself with the other. There were no welcome songs, no clapping children, no excited aunties waiting at the gate. Just the creak of the wooden door and the soft squeak of a lizard disappearing into a crack. This house, offered by her late father's cousin, became her refuge, the only place left that didn't treat her name like it was an offense. Inside, the room was bare save for a mattress on the floor and a small stool in the corner. She sat down slowly, trying not to let the silence crush her. Her hands rested on her belly, her thumbs drawing slow circles against the firm skin. She whispered gently to the child growing inside her, calling her by the name she had chosen long before the storm, Chikamso. The name meant "My God is with me," and it was her only shield against despair. She didn't cry that first night. The tears had already dried during her final walk out of ABA, when neighbors gathered in silence and Obinna stood like a tree that had forgotten its roots. That walk had stolen the last of her pride. All she had now was breath, and a faint flicker of will not to disappear completely. In the weeks that followed, Adeobi lived like a shadow in her own life. Her days were marked by routine, fetching water from the community tap, sweeping dust from the mud floor, boiling Gary with groundnuts when she could afford it, and sitting by the window watching time pass like strangers. The whispers from ABA had followed her to Enugu. Some relatives sent messages laced with pity, others with warnings. Don't come near our house. My husband must not see you. One of her cousins even blocked her on WhatsApp after she asked for baby clothes. Yet even in this wilderness of disgrace, Adeobi found moments of light. An elderly woman next door, Mama Igioma, would sometimes bring her ripe plantains and talk about the old days when women were not left to bleed alone. The woman's kindness came without questions, and it began to stitch a thread of warmth through Adeobi's lonely existence. Every evening, she walked slowly to a corner under the mango tree and sat there, rubbing her belly and humming old lullabies. She talked to her unborn child about things she never told anyone, about how she had dreamed of raising her in a house filled with love, how Obinna once painted the nursery blue before they even knew the baby was a girl, how she still remembered the smell of his skin when he held her during storms. But now the storm had taken him, and in his place stood silence. A silence that didn't explain, didn't apologize, didn't even pretend to hurt. When the time for labor came, it was not like she imagined it would be. It started one morning when the birds hadn't finished their first song. A sharp pain crawled through her lower back and circled her like a predator waiting for its moment. She waited for it to pass, breathing slowly as she'd been told at antenatal visits. But the pain returned, stronger, more demanding. By midday, her wrappers were soaked in sweat, and her cries filled the small house like wind during a storm. Mama Igioma heard her and ran over, calling for help as she laid Adaobi on the floor and placed a pillow beneath her back. There was no hospital visit, no padded delivery bed, no doctor calling out vitals. Just 3 women, a plastic bowl, and courage scraped from the bottom of a broken heart. The baby came with a cry that sounded like both victory and mourning. Chicamso arrived into the world like a sunrise after a storm, tiny and beautiful, her skin as soft as butter left under the sun. Adaobi held her daughter close and wept, not because of the pain, but because this was the only thing in her life that had come without disappointment. She looked down at her baby's face and whispered, "You are my beginning." That night, as the baby slept on her chest, Adaobi stared at the roof and let herself imagine what life would have been if the truth had come out. But some dreams were too dangerous to entertain. So she tucked the thought under her tongue and drifted into a sleep filled with both grief and grace. Far away in ABA, the house that once sang with laughter had grown strangely quiet. Obinna sat alone in the living room, the television playing to no one in particular. Nina walked in and out of rooms like she was searching for something she could no longer find. The walls were painted, the floor still tiled, but the air had changed. It smelled of missed calls, secrets, and uneasy silence. Obinna tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice, that a man could not rise if he was always waiting on a woman who walked like she was stuck in yesterday. He told himself that Adaobi had embarrassed him, brought disgrace to his name. But late at night, when the house was dark and Nina was asleep on the other end of the bed, he would sit outside on the veranda and light a cigarette he never smoked. He would stare into the darkness and remember Adaobi's laughter during their first harvest, the way she once danced barefoot in the rain, the time she surprised him with boiled yam and palm oil when business had failed and his spirit was low. Those memories came like mosquitoes, annoying, persistent, impossible to ignore. And still he said nothing. Not to Nina, not to his mother, not to anyone. Because admitting he had made a mistake would mean accepting that he had torn his house down with his own hands. And even fools know the weight of a ruined home. Nina watched him carefully now, sensing the shift in his silence, the way his eyes wandered toward empty corners. She had won the battle, yes, but sometimes victory came with a bitter aftertaste. The necklace sat in her jewelry box, but it no longer sparkled the way it did that night. Everything around her looked the same, yet felt unfinished, unearned. And when she passed the mirror, she saw it, the flicker of fear, the whisper of guilt, the shadow of a woman who had taken something that didn't belong to her and still couldn't make it shine. The days that followed Chicamso's birth were quiet but heavy, like air before rainfall. Adaobi spent her mornings cradling the child against her chest, rocking her in rhythm with the soft creaks of the old wooden stool. She had begun boiling herbs and grinding leaves behind the house, taught by Mama Igioma, who said bitter roots make the strongest healing. Every evening, the old woman would come by with fresh leaves, sometimes even slices of yam or leftover egusi soup. Adaobi received them with gratitude, but even her thank you sounded like a whisper now. She wasn't ashamed of her new life. No, she had already passed the stage of shame. What she carried now was something heavier, a quiet dignity that didn't need explanation. She walked to the well each day with Chicamso tied to her back, wrapped in a faded wrapper that bore the names of a long-forgotten politician. The other women in the area began to notice her, not because she tried to be noticed, but because sorrow had carved something raw and beautiful into her face. It was the look of someone who had survived without bitterness, someone whose silence had power. They began to greet her with more warmth, ask after the baby, offer tomatoes without expecting money. She never said much. Words had betrayed her once. Now she only used them when necessary. The few times she allowed herself to think about Obinna, it wasn't with anger, but a quiet ache, like the feeling of a song you once loved but now cannot sing because the melody reminds you of loss. Rumors had begun to drift into the neighborhood, carried by travelers and market women returning from ABA. Someone mentioned seeing Nina shouting at a driver in front of a building Obina once owned. Another said the contract that had made him wealthy had been revoked without warning, and that Obina's name was no longer being whispered in the corridors of power. Adeobi never asked questions, but she listened. Every piece of news was like a stone thrown into still water, disrupting her peace but not her resolve. She told herself it was none of her business, that she had buried that part of her life. But deep inside, she wondered what the truth really looked like now. One particular afternoon, while pounding yam for herself and Mama Igioma, a young woman from the next street came to her door. She had wide eyes and fast speech, and she said her name was Masoma. Adeobi recognized her instantly, though she had grown taller, her cheeks fuller than before. She had been the young maid in Obina's house months before everything fell apart. Adeobi remembered the day she left, without goodbye, without warning. Now here she stood, holding a plastic bag filled with baby clothes and a strange kind of urgency in her eyes. "Auntie Ada," she said softly, "please, I need to talk to you. There's something you need to know." Adeobi didn't move at first. Her body remained still, but her mind raced. The air between them stretched thin, full of possibilities. Masoma stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I know what happened with the necklace. I saw it. I saw everything." Masoma's confession came slowly, as though each word had to fight through the walls built by fear. She said she had returned to ABA briefly after marrying a man who worked in the Ministry of Justice in Auca. Her husband, curious about the things she mumbled in her sleep, had pushed her to speak. She finally did, and once the words were out, there was no stuffing them back in. She had been the one who cleaned Nina's room, who saw her slip the necklace into a scarf and later carry it toward Adeobi's room. She had followed her quietly, confused but curious. Through a narrow crack in the door, she watched Nina slide the scarf into Adeobi's trunk and lock it. Masoma had frozen, unsure of what to do. She said Nina noticed her shadow, threatened her with a blade, and warned her never to speak of what she saw. Out of fear and confusion, she fled the next day. But the guilt had never left her. Even now, standing in front of Adeobi, she looked as though her own conscience had been clawing at her ribs ever since. "I should have said something earlier," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I was scared. I didn't want to die." Adeobi listened without interrupting. She held Chikamso a little tighter and let the words settle. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. But something in her shifted, like soil being loosened after a long drought. For the first time since she left ABA, the silence inside her began to echo with a new sound, truth. The village square in ABA had not seen such a crowd in years. Word had spread fast that Masoma had returned to clear the name of a woman the village had spat out like spoiled broth. Elders sat on worn plastic chairs, their wrappers drawn tight, their walking sticks rested before them like swords of judgment. Obina stood at the far end, his face drawn, his agbada hanging loosely on shoulders that had once carried pride like armor. Nina arrived later, her face powdered but pale, her steps hurried but defensive. When Masoma began to speak, there was silence, thick and absolute. She told the story again, this time with eyes full of conviction and a voice no longer trembling. She described the night, the room, the sound of Nina's slippers, even the exact wrapper she used to carry the necklace. She spoke of the threat, the fear, and the guilt that haunted her every day. Some in the crowd gasped. Others muttered apologies under their breath. Obina said nothing. His face remained still, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. One of the elders turned to Nina, asked her to respond. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands began to shake. A woman from the back shouted, "Shame will finish you today." Another hissed, "We knew something wasn't right." Nina tried to speak again, but failed. Then she did something no one expected. She dropped to her knees and began to cry, begging for forgiveness, swearing she had only done what she had to do. But the village had heard enough. The truth, once buried under pride and lies, now danced freely in the open. Adeobi, who had remained in Enugu, was not there to see it. But the wind carried whispers of her vindication all the way to her small house, where she sat by the window feeding her child, unaware that the same people who once cursed her name were now struggling to pronounce it with honor again. The news of Nina's public confession reached Enugu not through letters or phone calls, but through human voices. Women returning from burial ceremonies in ABA, traders carrying dried fish and fresh gossip, a traveling pastor who stopped by Mama Igioma's compound and spoke about a woman whose enemies were now drinking the same shame they once poured for her. At first, Adeobi didn't react. She heard the words but treated them like the wind, unsure if they were real or just stories reshaped by mouths eager for drama. It wasn't until Masoma herself came again, this time with an envelope and the trembling confidence of someone who had faced fire and survived, that Adeobi began to accept that truth had finally climbed out of the pit where it was buried. Inside the envelope was a letter from the village council, a formal apology signed by the head elder, and a note that Obinna had stepped down from his chieftaincy selection to allow healing to begin. Adeobi read it 3 times. Her eyes scanned every line, not searching for apology, but for something deeper, a sign that her name was no longer dragging through mud in the mouths of strangers. Still, she didn't smile. Her face remained calm, her fingers tapping gently on Chikamso's back as the baby slept. Truth is slow, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But when it finally comes, it comes like harmattan, sudden and everywhere. She thanked Masoma quietly, then handed her some bitter cola for her journey. Nothing about her manner changed. She still woke early, still fetched water, still sang lullabies to her daughter. But inside her, something had shifted. It wasn't pride. It was peace, the kind that doesn't come with noise or fanfare, but settles deep like warm ash after fire. Obinna had stopped attending village meetings. He kept to himself, spending his days in the sitting room that now felt colder, no matter how much sunlight came through the window. The house, once filled with visitors and laughter, had become a shell, too quiet, too wide, and full of reminders he didn't know how to erase. The servants no longer lingered after work. They came, did their duties, and left without unnecessary talk. Even the air around him carried hesitation, as if it too had grown tired of circling a man who had lost his rhythm. The bed, once large enough for comfort, now felt like an ocean he had no strength to cross. Nina had disappeared. Some said she had returned to Lagos, others whispered about a breakdown, rumors thick with speculation and thin on truth. Obinna didn't bother to chase them. The necklace, once a symbol of legacy, now sat in a small wooden box on the shelf, dull, unpolished, and useless. He looked at it sometimes but never touched it. Instead, he smoked more than before, even though he still didn't like the taste. He would sit on the veranda at dusk, watching the compound grow dark, the same way his heart had. Memories had become sharp, biting things. He remembered the early years with Adeobi, the market trips, the small fights about salt in the soup, her laughter when the generator sputtered and died mid-prayer. He remembered the softness of her hands when she used to rub his back after long days, the way her silence carried wisdom instead of resentment. And then came the memory he tried hardest to forget. The day she stood in the middle of their compound, belly swollen, eyes wet, and still managed to bow her head as she was dragged away like a thief. That image lived behind his eyelids, waking him up more often than nightmares. The village, once convinced of Adeobi's guilt, now wore a new look, a quiet guilt wrapped in polite remorse. Some women began speaking her name again, this time with reverence. The same women who had called her a disgrace were now telling their daughters that Adeobi had been strong beyond reason. The elder who had once spit at her feet during the family meeting now sent palm oil to Mama Igioma with a message. "Tell our daughter she is still ours, if she will have us." But Adeobi didn't respond. She heard everything, nodded when told, but never sent a reply. Her silence became her answer. She wasn't angry. She had simply learned that some wounds needed more than words to heal. Every Sunday, she dressed Chikamso in a clean gown, tied her own wrapper, and walked slowly to the church near the market square. She sat quietly during service, never singing too loud, never praying with force, but always present. The priest once asked her to testify about her vindication. She declined. "Testimony is not only with mouth," she said, smiling gently. "Sometimes just living is enough." In town, she had become known not as the woman who was framed, but the woman who endured. People brought her herbs to sell, mothers asked her to name their babies, strangers gave her small coins without asking for anything in return. She never boasted, never corrected people's assumptions, never reminded anyone of the shame they once threw at her feet. And yet her presence did what her words refused to, corrected the record, piece by piece, without shouting. The day Obinna finally decided to visit Enugu was unplanned. He had spent the night turning from side to side, haunted by a dream of Adeobi walking into a river and disappearing while he stood on the bank, unable to reach her. When he woke, his heart felt like a dry gourd, empty and cracking. He dressed simply, carrying nothing but a bottle of olive oil and a quiet apology sitting in his throat. The journey was long and dusty. When he arrived, he didn't knock immediately. He stood at the door of her small house for nearly 10 minutes, listening to the sound of her humming inside. It wasn't a sad song. It was the kind of tune a woman sings when she has nothing to prove and nothing to fear. When he finally knocked, the door opened slowly. Adeobi stood there, her face as calm as he remembered, her eyes as unreadable as a sealed letter. She didn't greet him with surprise, nor with bitterness. She stepped aside and let him enter, saying only, "She's sleeping, don't wake her." He sat on the edge of the wooden stool, looked around at the room, the careful arrangement, the evidence of love without wealth. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Adeobi poured him water in a small cup and waited. After he drank, he said what he had carried for months. "I failed you." She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she looked at him with tired eyes. "You didn't just fail me. You failed the version of yourself I once believed in." Then she turned to adjust Chikamso's wrapper. Obina didn't argue. He only nodded, eyes damp. The silence between them wasn't cruel. It was the kind that comes when two people realize a chapter has truly closed, and even forgiveness doesn't rewrite the damage. The days that followed Obina's visit passed like water dripping from a silent roof, measured, unhurried, and impossible to ignore. He didn't return to ABA immediately. Instead, he stayed at a nearby guest house on the outskirts of Enugu, unsure of whether he was waiting for forgiveness, or simply punishing himself by being close enough to see the life that had gone on without him. Every morning, he stood by the same mango tree near the local chapel, watching Adeobi walk past with Chikamso tied to her back. She never looked in his direction, never acknowledged his presence, but he came anyway, sometimes with a bag of groceries he left on her doorstep before sunrise, sometimes with nothing but hope pressed into his pocket. He no longer expected anything. The silence she offered him now was not vengeful. It was final, like a door that had been closed without force. Adeobi, on her part, did not try to explain her decision to anyone. She had already given everything once before, her trust, her patience, her dignity. What remained now belonged to her and her daughter. There was no part of her spirit that still wished to be chosen again by someone who once unchose her. The people around her began to notice the change in her steps, the quiet way she carried herself, no longer heavy with sadness but wrapped in a robe of something deeper, completion. Not all healing makes noise. Some healing sits quietly in the corner, watching life bloom where pain once slept. A month passed before Obina returned to ABA, and when he did, it was as though time had folded itself while he was away. The house felt smaller, less proud. The compound, once full of people seeking favor or gossip, now greeted him with only the sound of his own shoes brushing against sand. He found his mother sitting on the veranda, her face lined not only with age, but with something like regret. They didn't speak much. Words between them had thinned into necessity over time. She asked if he had seen Adeobi. He nodded. She asked if she had accepted him back. He shook his head. Then she sighed a long, hollow sound. When you feed a snake and sleep beside it, it's only a matter of time before it remembers it has teeth. He didn't reply. The house, though standing, no longer felt like home. Nina's belongings were gone, though a few of her perfume bottles still sat untouched in the wardrobe, like ghosts of a choice made in the dark. Obina didn't remove them. He didn't touch the wardrobe at all. He began spending his evenings on the back steps, looking out at the same trees Adeobi once stood under when waiting for the rain to pass. Sometimes he whispered her name into the air, not expecting a response, but hoping it would reach her like mist reaches a sleeping garden. But there was no magic in the wind. There was only the quiet ache of a man who had finally understood the difference between possession and presence. He had possessed wealth, pride, beauty, but he had lost presence. The steady, unwavering presence of a woman who had once stood beside him, even when the roof leaked and the world doubted. In Enugu, life did not slow for Adeobi. She had begun making her own soap, simple, herbal blends wrapped in brown paper with names like Ojeki and Kemjika written in charcoal ink. It started with one order from a church member, then two from a woman who sold fabric across the street. Soon word spread. Her living room turned into a tiny workshop, and every evening she worked by lantern light while Chikamso napped. Business didn't make her rich, but it gave her purpose. It gave her something that belonged entirely to her, built not from pity or charity, but from grit and silence. Sometimes she would sit outside after a long day, cradling her child and watching the stars blink one by one. Mama Ijeoma had become family by proximity, her presence as consistent as sunrise. They would talk about small things, soup ingredients, how fast Chicamso was growing, how quiet the nights had become. Adeobi rarely mentioned the past, but when she did, it was like someone talking about another life, not out of pain but out of understanding. "I didn't lose everything," she told the old woman one night. "I lost only what I never truly had." The weight of that truth settled between them like a soft blanket. She had come out on the other side not triumphant in the way stories are often told, but whole in the way that matters. And that wholeness did not require a man, or a house, or even recognition. It only needed breath, resolve, and the willingness to let go of what once begged to stay. On a morning heavy with fog, Adeobi received a letter. It wasn't from Obinna, but from a lawyer in Owerri, informing her of a land document that had been transferred to her name. Property Obinna had quietly purchased years ago but never developed. The letter said nothing else. No apology, no explanation. Just the deed, neatly folded, signed and sealed. She stared at it for a long time, not with surprise, but with a kind of tired knowing. It was perhaps his final way of saying sorry, or maybe his way of giving something back he could no longer carry. She didn't reject it, but she also didn't celebrate. Instead, she folded the paper and tucked it away in a box where she kept Chicamso's hospital tags, a dried hibiscus flower from the day she gave birth, and the broken strap of a sandal she wore the night she left ABA. Some gifts are not for dancing. Some are for closing doors with grace. That evening, she walked to the church with Chicamso in her arms, dressed in a simple white gown that fluttered softly in the wind. She lit a candle not for vengeance or gratitude, but for clarity, that sacred middle ground where sorrow no longer swallows joy. As the flame flickered, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for Obinna, not for Nina, but for herself. That her voice would remain strong, her steps would remain firm, and her daughter would grow up knowing that silence is not weakness. It is survival in its most elegant form. In life, never doubt the quiet strength of a patient heart. What is hidden in darkness will always come to light, maybe not when we expect it, but always when it's meant to. Be slow to trade your dignity for approval. No matter how deep they bury the truth, it will rise, like the morning sun, uninvited and undeniable. Choose peace over revenge, and growth over bitterness. And if you ever find yourself walking through a season of disgrace, remember, you are not what they say, you are what you survive. May your name never be dragged where your hands have not been. May your truth speak louder than any lie spoken against you. May you never be replaced in your season of harvest by someone who did not suffer your planting. Where shame tried to sit, may honor rise and stand tall in your place. May God give you the kind of peace that makes no noise, yet settles every storm. May you be vindicated without lifting a finger, and may your story end in beauty, not bitterness. And for every tear you cried in secret, may joy visit you in public. In the name of the one who never sleeps on justice, somebody say a thunderous amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.